Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Jones, and today I will be presenting an analysis of President Andrew Johnson. President Johnson was born in 1808 in North Carolina, and he grew up in a poor family. His father was a porter at an inn, and he died when Andrew was 3, so he didn't get hardly any exposure to his dad. His mother was a laundress and a seamstress who worked at the inn. He never attended school and became apprenticed to a tailor in his teens. He later established himself in that trade in Tennessee. So he was pretty much self-educated by his wife, Eliza McCardle, who he married in 1827, and she helped him improve his reading and writing skills. And they ended up having 5 children together. He eventually was able to buy property and acquire several slaves who worked in his home. Johnson first entered politics when he was elected alderman in Greenville, Tennessee, which is where him and his wife eventually moved to. He was elected mayor of Greenville in 1834 and was later elected a year later to the Tennessee State Legislature, where he spent much of the early 30s and 40s. In 1843, he was voted into the House of Representatives, and he ended up introducing the act that became known as the Homestead Act, which was a major act enacted by Congress, and it granted large tracts of land to Western settlers in order to encourage people to move out to the frontier and expand the territories of the United States at the time. The defining issue during Johnson's time in the House was whether slaves should be allowed to spread to the newly settled Western territories, and he spent a lot of time working on this topic in Congress because he was very well versed in this area, especially because he introduced the Homestead Act. Johnson fundamentally believed that the U.S. Constitution guaranteed the right to own slaves, and it's something that he pretty much, his views never changed on this subject, and he ended up carrying that belief all the way until he became president. So as approaching his eventual presidency, in 1853, Johnson was elected governor of Tennessee, and he held the office until 1857 when he resigned to take over a U.S. Senate seat for Tennessee. And at this time, the struggle between the North and South over the issue of states' rights and slavery was intensifying, and at this point, Abraham Lincoln was debating his name was he eventually became Senator Douglas. He first entered the national stage because he was known for having those debates with Douglas. Johnson was firmly believed in the right to own slaves, but he was against the idea of seceding from the Union, believing the United States should stay together. And when the states who would eventually secede from the Union formed the Confederacy, he was the only senator from Tennessee to remain loyal to the Union. In return for Johnson's loyalty, President Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee in 1862 after much of its territory had been secured by the Union armies. He tried with mixed results to establish Union authority in the state because at that time a lot of people were still loyal to the Confederate cause, and it was difficult for Johnson to reassert control. At the 1864 National Union Party Convention, and the National Union Party was basically a name the Republican Party used in order to attract wider support and present face of national unity, and Johnson was specifically chosen to be the vice presidential nominee for that reason, because he was a Southerner, and Lincoln thought that presenting that face of national unity was important after the South would come back into the United States. A little over a year later, Johnson ended up being sworn in as the new president after Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth. So as far as let's talk about the the man Johnson was. He was very dedicated and he worked tirelessly at his job. He spent the book I read, I selected for my paper analysis, The Critical Year by Beale. He would get up early in the morning and he would work throughout the day, and typically he would be up until around like 1 or 2 a.m. So he's very hardworking. But he was persistently portrayed to be a drunk because he had given a slurred, incoherent speech at his inauguration as vice president. And this was actually because he had typhoid fever at the time, and he drank a little whiskey, or maybe not a little, but he drank some whiskey before the speech in order to give him strength to get through it. But it ended up really tarnishing his public image. And it was something that radical Republican newspapers consistently tried to sell to the American public, and in part it was successful. He was a very efficient administrator as well. He updated how the federal government kept their records. He was very he wrote letters and sought advice often. He wrote letters like every day. He was constantly sending out correspondence to get advice and communicate with his friends. His fatal flaw was his indecisiveness and reluctance to take a stand and make decisions quickly. The book noted that in conversations he would often nod and appear to agree with whoever he was talking to, but oftentimes he would end up making a decision that was different than what people thought he was indicating in their conversations. So Johnson could be a hard man to read. He was very reserved, and that probably came from the fact that he was self-educated, and his education did not equal a lot of the senators and representatives and those in federal government that he would end up working with. As far as his policies as president, Johnson firmly believed that the southern states should be quickly restored to the Union and new governments allowed to be elected. And this belief came from a view he shared with President Lincoln, in that he didn't believe that it was constitutionally possible for the southern states to secede from the Union in the first place. So both Lincoln and Johnson believed that they had been in the Union the whole time, but in rebellion. He thought that if the Union used its armies to force aggressive policies on the South, it would lead to decades of continued hostility between the North and South, and ultimately make it harder to restore relations between ordinary people. He ended up, as part of his this lenient policy, as his enemies would come to call it, he granted amnesty to most former Confederates except those that were in the highest echelons of Confederate leadership, like President Davis and his associates, and he allowed them to be elected in the new Southern governments as long as they swore an oath to be loyal to the Union. And these policies and beliefs put him at odds with the radical Republicans who would eventually gain control of Congress in his presidency. His domestic achievements, Johnson tried repeatedly to get his vision of Reconstruction implemented, but most of his attempts were stopped by the radical Republicans. So he would have had to have always compromised to get anything passed, but oftentimes what he was willing to give was not enough for the radical Republicans. So almost all the legislation hardly resembled anything like what was his original vision. He actually became known as the veto president because he gave a lot of vetoes in his presidency. Almost everything that Congress sent to his desk, he vetoed, though most of his vetoes were overridden. For example, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which drastically expanded civil rights for recently freed African Americans. And this ended up making it even more impossible to compromise with his enemies in Congress, because vetoing the 14th Amendment ended up causing a lot of moderate Republicans to go over to the side of the radicals. He eventually attempted to remove Secretary of War Stanton from his post, but this ended up backfiring and allowed Congress to justify impeaching him because he had violated the 10-year of office act, which Congress had purposely passed in order to make it more difficult for Johnson to remove people from his cabinet. And he ended up being acquitted by one vote in the Senate, but after that he was even more ineffectual as president. Like, he had almost no influence to actually get real policy passed at that point. His foreign policy achievements, his major foreign policy achievement was the purchase of the Alaska Territory in 1867 for $7.2 million. And this was actually controversial because a lot of people in the U.S. They really didn't know anything about Alaska, other than that it had been owned by the Russians, and they really didn't see the point in purchasing it. So the whole purchase came to be known as Seward's Folly, after it's named after Secretary of State William Seward, who served in the administration of Lincoln and Johnson. He reinforced the Monroe Doctrine as president. He ended up sending 50,000 U.S. soldiers to the Mexican border to convince French troops to withdraw from Mexico, and Napoleon III, who was Emperor of France, ended up withdrawing them. At the time, he was trying to put a person who he thought would be loyal to France on the throne in Mexico, to be like Emperor of Mexico, but this was something that was not supported by most of the Mexican population at the time. Johnson's presidency also saw the restorations of relations with Great Britain. He enforced net neutrality laws against Irish American Fenians, which they were a group who were attempting to annex Canada, which was controlled by Britain. And this was something that was very good at the time, because relations with Great Britain had been strained ever since Confederate representatives during the Civil War had gone to Britain to convince them to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. His impact on the presidency as an institution, basically the powers of the presidency were weakened by Johnson's actions. His ineffectiveness and personal limitations as a leader weakened a lot of the powers of the institution. An example of this is the 10-year of office act I mentioned earlier. This act limited Johnson's ability to remove cabinet officials. I would note, though, that this was most likely politically motivated, because several members of Johnson's cabinet were in fact on the side of the radicals. They just publicly supported Johnson. So in a sense, his violation of the act and which led to his eventual impeachment ended up setting a precedent for the presidents that would come after, where their powers were more limited than they were under, for example, President Lincoln. Johnson's stubbornness and refusal to compromise almost led to him again being removed from office, which if he had been removed from office, that would have weakened the presidency even more. He did have an impact on improving the administration of the executive branch logistically, but as far as the actual powers that the president had, some of them, they were lower than they were before Johnson. And these are my references, and that is my presentation. Thank you.